Welcome back everyone to my channel. Today we're going to talk about a topic that might be a bit difficult to discuss. A bit sensitive, but I believe it's extremely important and necessary for everyone to know. You see, that is how we can recognize when someone might be stalking us. This is not about normal relationships or healthy attention, but about persistent, unwanted harassment, repeated behavior that can make us feel insecure and afraid. Why does this topic need to be discussed? And why is it particularly important for both young people and middle-aged people in the US? Statistics and studies show that stalking behavior is an alarming issue. And it can happen to anyone, regardless of age, gender, or social background. Both young and middle-aged people can become victims. But they might face different forms of stalking or from different perpetrators. For young people, they might be easily stalked through social media, online apps, by people they know online, or even former classmates or ex-partners. The boom of technology makes collecting information and accessing targets easier than ever. Cybersecurity studies also indicate that online harassment, including cyberstalking, is on the rise. As for middle-aged people, they might be targets of stalking related to past relationships, colleagues, or people they meet in daily life. Sometimes, these stalkers are people the victim once had a close relationship with, such as ex-spouses in domestic violence cases. Data also shows that women of all ages are at higher risk of being stalked than men. But men are not exempt either. So, how can we recognize the warning signs that someone might be stalking us? This is when we need to open our eyes wide and pay attention to unusual, repeated, and unwanted behavior. The first sign is persistent unwanted contact. Stalkers might repeatedly call, text, or email you, even though you've clearly expressed that you don't want contact anymore. The number of calls and messages can be very high, at unusual times, or with scary or threatening content. A specific example is this. A young person blocked all contact via phone and social media after breaking up with their ex-partner. But the ex still found ways to contact them via email, create fake accounts on other platforms, and even message their friends to ask about them. This is clearly unhealthy obsessive behavior. Or a middle-aged person receives dozens of missed calls from an unknown number every day, saying nothing when answered, just silent before hanging up. This repeated behavior makes them feel anxious and uneasy. The second sign is showing up in places you are present unexpectedly and uninvited. Stalkers might suddenly appear at your workplace, at your home, without a valid reason, in places you frequent like coffee shops or gyms, or even at your private events. For example, a colleague you're not close to suddenly appears at the grocery store you usually shop at on the weekend. The first time might be a coincidence. But if this happens repeatedly, and they seem to be deliberately paying attention to you, then you need to be vigilant. Or someone you've only met a few times suddenly knows your home address and sends things, even though you've never given them that address. This is clearly problematic. It's like the old saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. Unusual coincidences happening repeatedly like this are usually not random. The third sign is illegally or suspiciously collecting information about you. You know, stalkers might go through your trash, hack into your email or social media accounts, plant listening devices or trackers on your car or in your home. You see, they might ask people around you about your schedule and habits. You know, for example, you suddenly see ads for products that you only just talked about with friends in real life, without ever searching for them online. You know, this could be due to listening devices or your accounts being monitored. You know, or an acquaintance constantly asks about your friends and family in unusual detail, and seems to know a lot of private information about you that you've never shared with them. You see, this clearly means they've found ways to get information from other sources. You know, the fourth sign is threatening or harmful behavior. You know, stalkers might send threatening messages, emails, or letters, or damage your property. You see, they might threaten to harm you, your loved ones, or your pets to make you afraid. You know, for example, you receive an anonymous message with detailed content about where you've just been, accompanied by a threat. You know, or your car is suddenly vandalized, your house door mysteriously damaged. You see, these behaviors are more serious and show that the stalker wants to make you afraid and feel helpless. You know, the fifth sign relates to cyberstalking, which is stalking online. You know, stalkers might constantly monitor your activity on social media, leave harassing comments, create fake posts about you, or use your personal information to bother others. You see, for example, every time you post a photo or update your status on social media, that person is the first to like or leave a comment, even if you don't want them to. You know, or you discover that someone has created a fake account using your name to post false or sensitive content. You see, these are clear signs of being stalked in the online space. You know, so, if you start to notice one or more of these signs, what should you do? You know, the most important thing is don't ignore it. You know, don't think you're being overly sensitive, or it's probably nothing. Your intuition is an important tool. You know, as older people often say, better safe than sorry. When something feels off, listen to your body and mind. You know, the next extremely important step is to document everything. You know, keep a detailed diary, recording the date, time, and location of every instance you notice suspicious behavior. You know, save all messages, emails, photos, or any other evidence related to the stalking behavior. You know, this detailed information will be very helpful if you decide to report it to the police or seek legal help. You know, it's like the old saying, where's the proof? Evidence is very important. You know, thirdly, tell someone you completely trust about what's happening. You know, this could be a family member, close friend, trusted colleague, or your supervisor. You know, sharing not only helps you get emotional support but also lets someone else know about your situation, in case something bad happens. You know, don't keep everything to yourself, because one tree doesn't make a forest. Having someone by your side will make you stronger. You know, fourthly, increase your personal safety measures. You know, change your daily routine. Take different routes to work or home. You know, be more careful when going out alone, especially at night. You know, check your privacy settings on social media. Block strangers or suspicious people. You know, change strong passwords for all your important accounts. You know, consider installing security cameras or alarm systems if you feel it's necessary. You know, do everything to feel safer in your living space. You know, Fifthly, absolutely do not confront the stalker directly. You know, this can make the situation worse and put you in danger. You know, avoid all interaction with them. Don't reply to messages, calls, or any other form of contact. You know, it's like the saying, better to yield than to fight. In this case, your safety is the most important thing. You know, sixthly, contact law enforcement. You know, the police can help you assess the situation, advise you on the next steps to take, and if necessary, they can intervene to protect you. You know, provide them with all the evidence you've collected. You know, seventhly, seek support from organizations that help victims of stalking or domestic violence. You know, they can provide you with legal advice, psychological support, and other necessary resources to help you cope with this situation. You know, you don't have to fight alone. You know, I know that recognizing and dealing with stalking behavior is a scary and difficult process. You know, but remember that you are not alone and there are resources available to help you. You know, equipping yourself with the knowledge to recognize the signs early and knowing how to act is the best way to protect yourself and prevent the situation from escalating. You know, oh, and as before, I've received some requests about the topic of foods good for memory and concentration, along with recipes and health advice too. You know, I really appreciate your interest and these great suggestions. You know, however, to keep the content of this video completely focused on the important topic of recognizing stalking behavior and how to protect yourself, I'd like to reserve the topic of foods good for brain health and general health for a separate video in the future. You know, I promise to have a very detailed and useful separate video on that topic. You know, thank you all very much for your understanding and for suggesting it. You know, going back to today's topic, you know, I hope the sharing just now has given everyone more knowledge and confidence to recognize the signs of being stalked and how to respond. You know, personal safety is paramount. You know, never underestimate feelings of unease or repeated suspicious behavior. You know, now it's time for me to hear from you. You know, have you ever encountered any suspicious situations that made you worry about your safety? Or do you have any other tips or advice on how to stay safe online and in real life that you'd like to share with the community? Please leave your comments below this video. You know, let's create a safe space together to share and learn. You know, or if you have any questions related to this topic, don't hesitate to ask. You know, I and others in the community will try our best to help. You know, thank you all very much for spending time watching a rather sensitive and long topic today. You know, I know it's not easy to talk about these things, but I believe that raising awareness is the first and most important step to protecting ourselves and those around us. You know, if you found this content useful and want to see more videos from me on important topics in modern life, from online safety to mental health and self-development, don't forget to hit the like button. Share this video with your friends and family. And most importantly, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell icon right away so you don't miss any new content in the future. You know, your support is the biggest motivation to help the channel grow and bring more valuable content. You know, see you all in the next videos. You know, always be careful and stay safe.